fly.
Have you ever had that feeling that you just don't belong? I know this may come as a shock to you, but I have had that feeling multiple times in my life. In fact, there's one instance in particular that really sticks out in my mind. We had just finished a global outreach trip to Tampa, Florida, and we were making our way back, driving from Tampa all the way to Springfield. Now, luckily, we spent a night in Atlanta to break up the trip, but I was totally exhausted after this week, and I knew that we needed to make this drive back. And so I did what most leaders do before you get into vans for a long road trip, is you say, all right, guys, everyone needs to go use the bathroom. Well, I thought I would just take my own advice on this. So I walked into the bathroom, I found a stall, and it was just a few seconds later that someone came in after me. And then I heard something. It was giggling. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in a men's restroom before, but giggling is something that never happens. And it was in that moment that I realized I'm in the girls' bathroom. I was definitely in a place where I don't belong. Now, as Christians who live in a fallen world, we live in a place where we really don't belong. We should have those feelings that this isn't really my home. In fact, James tells us that anyone who is a friend of the world is actually an enemy of God. We are to live different, be different, think different, act different than the way the world does. Yet God calls us to engage and to influence the world for His name. So how do we do this? Well, when we come to Acts chapter 17, Paul gives us an example of how we engage the world, a lost and sinful world, a fallen world, and help them follow Jesus. In fact, in Acts chapter 17, verse 16, it says, "Now while Paul was waiting for them in Athens," he was waiting for Timothy and Silas to come join him because they had just been persecuted at Thessalonica, then they fled to Berea, and now Paul is in Athens, and Timothy and Silas are going to join him. So while Paul's waiting for them in Athens, it says that his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So as Paul walked around this city, he saw the inscriptions and the temples and the worship that was happening to something that wasn't real. And it broke Paul's heart. And so what did Paul do? Well, he began to preach both at the synagogue and he began to preach at the marketplace about Jesus. You see, if we're going to engage a world that is lost and fallen with the message of Jesus, we have to see people as lost, not as wrong. Paul very easily could have approached people as wrong. In fact, growing up as a young Jewish boy, he would have learned early on the very first commandment is have no other gods before me, have no other gods before God Himself. And he very easily could have stood outside of temples condemning people as they went in to worship their false gods. He could have held picket signs that said no idols here. He could have blasted people on social media if it existed in his day, but instead he chose to see people as lost. His heart broke for what they were doing because they didn't know the one true living God. And so Paul began to preach. He began to preach about Jesus. He goes to the marketplace and he begins talking about Jesus, and there are some philosophers that start to notice him. They're the Stoic and the Epicurean philosophers, and they invite him from the marketplace to go to the Areopagus. Now, this was the place where education and religion was pretty much talked about. And Paul steps into this environment and he begins a speech about Jesus. In fact, in Acts chapter 17, I love how Paul begins his speech. I can just picture it with a crowd all around him. And here's what he says. He says, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with the inscription, 'To the unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I will proclaim to you." So what's Paul saying? Paul's saying, as I walked around your city, I saw that you were devout. And I saw that there is an altar to an unknown God. And today I'm going to tell you about that unknown God. What was Paul doing in this moment? He was using culture as a bridge, not a barrier. And if we're going to engage this culture with the message of Jesus, we need to see the culture around us and the culture around the people that we're serving not as a barrier, but ultimately as a bridge to knowing Jesus. I think it's very easy for Christians to judge the world around them and to criticize it. In fact, I think we've even done this to the point that we've developed our own music, our own art, our own bookstores, or even our own venues for certain activities and organizations. And while those things are not bad in themselves, I just want to remind us that our goal is not to be isolated from the world, but rather it's to be insulated in the world. And Paul ultimately built a bridge between the culture that was around him and helping people who lived in that culture know Jesus. I'm reminded of a story of Don Richardson, who was a missionary to Papua New Guinea. Don was looking for a way to communicate the gospel to these tribes, and there were two tribes in particular that were in a bitter blood feud between each other. The only way that these tribes would ever have peace, Don discovered, is if the two chiefs came together and offered a peace child. It was an offering of their own child to live with the opposing tribe. And as long as that child lived, there would be peace between the two tribes. And Don said, I got it. He said, that's a picture of Jesus. That's God offering his son on our behalf so that we can have peace ultimately with him. And because Don engaged this culture and he looked into the culture and he said, how can I build a bridge ultimately with a culture that is around people, and how can I build this bridge to help them discover Jesus and follow Jesus? People followed in Papua New Guinea. And because Paul did the same thing in Athens, people believed in Athens. And I just want you to think about this and think about how we can engage the world around us. That people are not an argument to win or a problem to fix, but rather people are lost and they need direction. They need guidance. And when you look at the culture around these people, how can you build a bridge between the environment that they're in, the culture that they're in, and ultimately the hope and the restoration that happens with Jesus?